A cop pepper-sprayed a black woman in broad daylight, assuming she was just another civilian who refused to follow orders. He called her a liar, dismissed her words, and treated her with complete disrespect. But then something fell from her bag, leaving him frozen in shock. What could have possibly made him regret his actions so deeply? It all started when this officer, known for his aggressive and judgmental behavior, spotted a woman in a parking lot after a long day at work. She was minding her business, carrying her bag when she suddenly became his target. Without any real reason, he approached her, demanding answers in his usual hostile tone. His words were sharp, his demeanor intimidating. He was convinced she was someone who didn't belong. The woman calmly tried to explain herself, but her efforts were ignored. Instead of listening, he escalated the situation, accusing her of lying about her presence there. She remained composed, even as his voice grew louder and his behavior more aggressive. And then, in a shocking moment, he pepper-sprayed her, forcing her to shield her face and stumble back in pain. What happened next, however, left the officer speechless. As she reached for her belongings on the ground, something slipped from her bag and landed at his feet. A badge. A police badge. She wasn't just any woman. She was an officer of the law. And in that moment, everything changed. The crowd that had gathered murmured in disbelief as the officer's face turned pale with realization. Where are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and stay tuned to learn what happens when prejudice collides with authority in this unbelievable story. A cop confidently pepper-sprays a black woman during a heated exchange, believing he's asserting control. But the moment her badge falls out of her pocket, everything changes. The officer's smug expression vanishes, replaced by disbelief and dread. What happens when someone judged for their appearance reveals their true authority? The air was thick with tension, as onlookers held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The officer froze, his eyes darting between the badge on the ground and the woman he had just assaulted. What should have been a routine interaction had spiraled into something far bigger. Before diving further, let's get to know the woman at the center of this shocking moment. She isn't just anyone. Her life tells a story of resilience and justice. Growing up in an underserved neighborhood, she knew early on how society unfairly judged people based on their appearance. Determined to make a difference, she worked tirelessly to succeed, earning her place in law enforcement, a system she vowed to reform from within. Her badge symbolized more than her authority. It represented her fight against a system that often failed those it was meant to protect. Despite her rank and accomplishments, she carried herself with humility, understanding the responsibility her position demanded. Yet here she stood, face burning from pepper spray, not as an officer, but as a victim of the very bias she had sworn to challenge. And then there was the cop, a man with a different story. Known for his aggressive tactics and quick temper, he had earned a reputation for targeting individuals he deemed suspicious. To him, appearances were enough to justify his actions. With a history of complaints swept under the rug, he felt invincible. But today, his overconfidence had led him to target the wrong person. As the woman bent to pick up her badge, the crowd buzzed with murmurs. The officer's earlier bravado had evaporated. His actions had exposed the stark reality of his prejudices, and now he was left to face the consequences. The woman, however, didn't respond with anger. Instead, she locked eyes with him, her expression a mix of disappointment and strength. "Did you even stop to think about what you were doing?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. The crowd watched, their smartphones capturing every second. This was no ordinary encounter. This was a moment that revealed the glaring flaws in a system that allowed bias to dictate actions. What happens next? Will this officer be held accountable for his actions, or will he, like so many before him, escape unscathed? And how will the woman turn this unjust moment into an opportunity for change? The officer stood frozen, staring at the badge in the woman's hand. It gleamed under the sunlight, a sharp contrast to the officer's now paling face. The crowd murmured louder, phones capturing the unexpected turn of events. Just moments ago, this cop had been confident, deploying pepper spray without hesitation. Now, he looked as though the ground had been pulled out from under him. The woman wiped her face, the pepper spray still stinging her skin, but her focus never wavered. "So," she said calmly, holding up the badge, "do you still think you're above accountability? But who is this woman?" To understand her composure and strength in such a moment, let's delve into her story. She didn't become who she is today without overcoming countless obstacles. Born in a small town where opportunities were scarce, she learned early on that success wouldn't come easily. She was determined to change not only her future, but also the system that seemed rigged against her community. Her dream to join law enforcement wasn't just about wearing a badge. It was about making sure that the people in her community, those who were often ignored or mistreated, had someone on their side. She climbed the ranks through sheer grit and determination, never losing sight of her mission to serve justice fairly. Yet even with all her achievements, she never forgot where she came from. She carried herself with humility, but when faced with injustice, she didn't hesitate to stand her ground. Today, she wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been judged unfairly. And then there's the cop, a man whose story couldn't be more different. Known among his peers for his quick temper and questionable tactics, he had a long history of pushing boundaries. Complaints of misconduct followed him, but none ever stuck, thanks to a system that protected its own. Over time, he grew bolder, believing he was untouchable. Today, that confidence had led him to make a grave mistake. In his mind, the woman before him was just another civilian he could intimidate. He didn't see her for who she truly was. He didn't see her as a leader, as someone who had earned the respect of her peers and her community. The crowd grew louder as the tension in the air became unbearable. The woman's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the officer's growing panic. She stepped forward, her voice steady and commanding. "Do you know what this badge represents? It represents integrity, something you clearly lack." This was no longer just about the interaction between these two individuals. This was about the power of assumptions and the consequences of acting on them without thinking. The officer, now visibly shaken, opened his mouth to respond, but quickly closed it, realizing that anything he said could further incriminate him. The weight of the moment, the crowd's scrutiny, and the woman's unwavering strength were too much to handle. What do you think should happen next? Will justice prevail, or will this officer's actions be swept under the rug like so many before him? Let us know where you're watching from, and share your thoughts in the comments below. This story is far from over, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The officer stood in stunned silence, his confidence shattered as the woman's badge gleamed in her hand, a reminder of his mistake. The crowd murmured louder, their phones recording every moment. The tension was palpable, and the woman's unwavering gaze only heightened the officer's discomfort. "What's the matter?" the woman asked, her voice calm but firm. "Cat got your tongue? Or is it the weight of accountability?" The officer's hesitation hung in the air, but the woman wasn't about to let the moment pass. She had worked too hard, faced too much, to stay silent now. "Let me make something clear," she began, her voice carrying authority and conviction. "This badge represents justice, fairness, and respect, principles you've clearly forgotten." But what brought her to this moment? Her life hadn't been an easy journey. Growing up in a neighborhood often overlooked and under-resourced, she saw firsthand how bias and prejudice shaped the experiences of people who looked like her. She vowed early on that she would change that. Determined to make a difference, she excelled in school, worked tirelessly, and eventually joined law enforcement. Her goal was never just to wear the uniform. It was to bring real change to a system that too often failed her community. Over the years, she earned her colleagues' respect and rose through the ranks, becoming a symbol of integrity and resilience. Her path wasn't without challenges. She faced skepticism from those who doubted her abilities, and resistance from those who resented her presence. But she never let it stop her. She believed that actions spoke louder than words, and her actions proved she was more than capable. The officer in front of her represented the exact kind of behavior she had spent her career fighting against. Known for his arrogance and history of overstepping his authority, he was the type who believed his badge gave him unchecked power. Complaints about his misconduct had piled up over the years, but a lack of accountability kept him on the streets. To him, the woman was just another civilian he could intimidate. He didn't see her strength, her resilience, or her accomplishments. He acted on his assumptions, and now he was facing the consequences. The woman stepped closer, her badge still in hand. "You thought you could disrespect me without knowing who I am," she said. "But here's the thing. You shouldn't need to know my rank or my achievements to treat me with respect. That should be the bare minimum." The crowd erupted in applause, their support fueling her confidence. The officer's face reddened as the reality of his actions sank in. His attempt to exert power had backfired spectacularly, and now he was the one under scrutiny. This wasn't just about one interaction. It was about a system that allowed people like him to act without consequence, and about the need for change. The woman's voice rose above the murmurs of the crowd. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about every person who's been disrespected, mistreated, or ignored because of assumptions. It stops here." The officer's head hung low, his arrogance replaced with visible shame. The crowd watched intently, waiting to see what would happen next. The woman knew this moment was bigger than her, bigger than him. It was a chance to spark a conversation about accountability and respect. What do you think should happen now? Should the officer face consequences for his actions, or will the system once again protect one of its own? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from. This story is far from over, and the next chapter will leave you speechless. The officer stood frozen as the woman's powerful words echoed in his mind. The crowd's murmurs had turned into a wave of disapproval directed squarely at him. The badge she held in her hand felt like a symbol of everything he had failed to respect: justice, fairness, and dignity. The gravity of the moment began to weigh on him, and he couldn't look her in the eye. The woman lowered her badge but maintained her firm stance. "You have made your intentions clear," she said, her voice steady but cutting. "Now, it's time for accountability." She gestured to the crowd, whose phones continued to record, ensuring the world would witness what happened here. "You thought you could act without consequences, but let me assure you, those days are over." As the tension hung in the air, it became evident that the crowd had grown beyond just bystanders. These were people who had experienced or witnessed similar injustices, and this moment was personal for them. They weren't just watching, They were part of a movement, one that was no longer willing to stay silent. But how did we get here? The woman's journey to this point had been anything but easy. From a young age, she had understood the challenges of being a woman of color in a society that often judged her before she could prove herself. Growing up, she faced stereotypes and assumptions that tried to limit her, but she refused to let them define her. Her family had always encouraged her to dream big and to believe in the power of resilience. When she decided to join law enforcement, many doubted her choice. Some thought she wouldn't last in such a demanding field, while others believed she couldn't make a difference in a system riddled with flaws. But she had a vision to ensure that justice was not just a word, but a reality for everyone. She worked tirelessly, overcoming bias and skepticism, and earned her badge through sheer determination and excellence. Her rank, though impressive, was not what defined her. It was her unwavering commitment to fairness and integrity. On the other hand, the officer before her was the stark opposite. He had joined the force with dreams of power rather than service. Over time, he became known for using his badge as a weapon rather than a shield. His record was marred with complaints of excessive force and biased treatment, but the system's protection allowed him to continue unchecked. His arrogance grew, and he became accustomed to acting with impunity, believing he was untouchable. The woman's words had struck a chord with the crowd, many of whom began to share their stories of facing similar treatment. Each voice added to the weight of the moment, and the officer found himself surrounded not just by people, but by their collective pain and frustration. For the first time, he realized that his actions were part of a larger problem, a system that had fostered his behavior and allowed it to persist. The woman looked at him again, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't just about what you did to me," she said. "It's about what you represent. It's about the countless others who've been treated like less than human simply because of assumptions." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But today, we're sending a message that enough is enough." The officer's silence spoke volumes. His confidence had crumbled, and the crowd could see the doubt creeping into his expression. The woman knew that this moment was only the beginning. "We'll ensure this doesn't end here," she said. "The system that allows this behavior will be held accountable too." As the crowd began to applaud and cheer in support, the officer turned away, his arrogance replaced with visible regret. He had underestimated the strength of one person willing to stand up for what was right. The woman turned to the crowd, her voice carrying over the noise. "Thank you for standing with me," she said. "Together, we can make sure justice is served for everyone." What do you think should happen next? Should this officer face consequences for his actions, or is the system itself the bigger problem? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from. This story isn't over, and the next chapter will reveal just how far the fight for justice can go. The crowd's applause had barely subsided when the woman took a step forward, her voice steady and resolute. "This is just the beginning," she declared, holding her badge firmly in her hand. The officer's silence lingered as the weight of his actions began to bear down on him. His previously confident demeanor had turned into something else, uncertainty. Yet the woman's words weren't just for him. They were for the system that had allowed this behavior to thrive. The tension of the moment dissolved as the woman turned away, making her way through the crowd. The people around her looked on with admiration, many realizing they had just witnessed something greater than a personal confrontation. This was a stand against injustice, a stand that symbolized hope for many who had felt powerless for far too long. But while the crowd began dispersing, questions lingered. What would happen now? Would the officer face the consequences of his actions, or would this be swept under the rug like so many incidents before it? As the murmurs of uncertainty grew, the woman remained focused. She had been here before. She knew this fight wasn't about one person or one moment. It was about creating a ripple effect that would demand accountability at every level. Behind the scenes, the officer struggled to process what had unfolded. His arrogance had masked an underlying truth he had avoided acknowledging for years. His actions weren't just mistakes. They were choices born from a system that had nurtured his prejudices and failed to hold him accountable. For the first time, he began to question himself, not because he suddenly understood the harm he caused, but because the public pressure left him no room to hide. The woman, meanwhile, wasted no time. She reached out to her colleagues, ensuring they understood the severity of what had happened. This wasn't going to end with an apology or a simple reprimand. She was determined to see real action taken. She knew that exposing one officer's actions was a step, but dismantling the larger system of inequality would take more. That was the real goal, and she was ready to fight for it. The crowd's videos of the incident began spreading rapidly online, gaining traction in just hours. Social media was flooded with outrage, with hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #BadgeOfTruth trending globally. People shared their own stories of injustice, creating a wave of solidarity that transcended borders. The woman's actions had inspired a movement that now demanded change. But as support for her grew, so did the resistance. Critics began to emerge, accusing her of overreacting or attempting to tarnish the image of law enforcement. Why couldn't she just let it go? Some asked. Others questioned her intentions, suggesting that her actions were motivated by personal gain rather than a genuine desire for justice. These voices, however, were drowned out by the overwhelming support from those who saw her as a symbol of courage and resilience. The woman understood the importance of this moment. She knew that her next steps would set a precedent for others in similar situations. She worked tirelessly with community leaders, activists, and legal experts to craft a clear message. This wasn't about vilifying all officers. It was about accountability, fairness, and rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. The officer, now facing internal investigations, found himself isolated. Colleagues who had once stood by him began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. The system that had protected him for so long now saw him as a liability. As he sat alone, the magnitude of his choices began to sink in. The woman's efforts extended beyond the immediate incident. She advocated for mandatory training programs to address bias within law enforcement, pushing for transparent review processes that would prevent such abuses from occurring in the future. Her work wasn't just about punishing one officer. It was about creating a culture where such actions were no longer tolerated. As days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of her stand continued to grow. Communities across the country began organizing their own initiatives to address systemic issues, inspired by her courage and determination. What started as a single moment of confrontation had transformed into a nationwide conversation about justice and equality. The officer, once confident that he was untouchable, now faced the reality of his actions. The investigations uncovered a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. He was suspended from duty and would soon face legal proceedings. The system, though flawed, had begun to respond. The woman, reflecting on the journey so far, knew there was still a long way to go. But as she stood among a crowd of supporters, she felt a sense of hope. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like progress was within reach. What are your thoughts on this turning point? Should the focus remain on individual accountability, or is systemic reform the ultimate goal? Let us know where you're watching from and share your perspective in the comments. This story continues, and so does the fight for equality and fairness. The tension from the last encounter still lingered as the woman took her fight to the next level. Her voice, calm yet commanding, resonated across platforms. "This isn't just about one badge or one person," she said in a live broadcast that reached thousands. "This is about every voice silenced, every injustice ignored, and every opportunity we have to make a difference." Her words carried the weight of the moment and the hope of a better future. The public response to the video of the incident was explosive. Millions of views translated into a cascade of support. People shared their own experiences, flooding social media with hashtags like #AS Badge of Change and #HaidNu Justice for All. The pressure was mounting not just on the officer, but on the entire system that allowed such actions to persist. Within the department, discussions turned into heated debates. Some officers defended their colleague, claiming the situation was exaggerated. Others, however, admitted the department needed to address its shortcomings. The spotlight was now on everyone, not just the officer at the center of the controversy. Meanwhile, the woman worked tirelessly to ensure this moment wouldn't be forgotten. She partnered with legal experts to draft policy recommendations aimed at preventing future incidents. These proposals focused on increasing accountability, mandating anti-bias training, and establishing transparent review boards for misconduct cases. She understood that meaningful change required action, not just words. The officer, suspended and under investigation, faced a whirlwind of consequences. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by a mixture of defiance and fear. The internal investigation revealed troubling patterns of behavior that extended beyond the incident caught on video. Complaints that had previously been dismissed were now being revisited, adding to the growing case against him. As public pressure intensified, city officials held a press conference to address the situation. The mayor, flanked by community leaders, acknowledged the gravity of the incident and pledged to take decisive action. "We cannot allow incidents like this to define our city," the mayor said. "We must rebuild trust and ensure accountability within our institutions." The woman attended the press conference, her presence commanding attention. Reporters bombarded her with questions, but her focus remained clear. "This isn't about me," she stated firmly. "It's about creating a system that works for everyone, not just a select few. We need to hold people accountable." From the top down, the investigation's findings were damning. The officer was found guilty of multiple violations, leading to his dismissal from the force. But the woman knew this was just one victory in a much larger battle. The systemic issues that enabled such behavior were still intact, and she was determined to address them. As the dust began to settle, the woman shifted her focus to education and advocacy. She launched a program to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. The initiative included workshops, community meetings, and mentorship opportunities aimed at fostering understanding and cooperation. The ripple effect of her efforts was undeniable. Communities across the country took notice, adopting similar initiatives to address their own challenges. Her story became a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up for what's right, inspiring countless others to do the same. The officer, now out of the spotlight, reflected on his choices. The realization of how far he had fallen weighed heavily on him. His arrogance had cost him not only his career but also the respect of those he once worked alongside. He was a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked behavior. For the woman, the journey was far from over. Each step forward brought new challenges, but she remained unwavering in her mission. Her fight wasn't just for justice. It was for a future where stories like hers would no longer be necessary. In her final words at a community event, she addressed a crowd of supporters. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen alone. It takes all of us working together to create the world we want to live in. And together, we will. What do you think about the steps she took to bring about change? Would you have handled it differently, or do you see this as the path forward? Share your thoughts, and stay tuned for more stories of courage and determination. The energy from the last public event had not faded. The woman's call for justice continued to echo across communities and online platforms. Her final words, "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen alone," sparked a wave of action. People who had been silent began sharing their own experiences, turning the spotlight on broader issues within the system. Amid the growing movement, discussions about policy reform intensified. Activists, community leaders, and lawmakers came together to address the gaps in accountability. Public forums were held, and ideas were exchanged with a clear focus on actionable solutions. The woman led many of these conversations, her badge now a symbol of resilience and hope for change. The officer, meanwhile, faced the fallout of his actions. After losing his position, he struggled to find his footing. The internal investigation had unveiled a pattern of misconduct that couldn't be ignored. As part of his sentence, he was required to attend mandatory training on bias and accountability. Though his arrogance had once shielded him, the reality of his mistakes began to weigh heavily on him. The department was not spared from scrutiny either. The investigation spurred city officials to implement sweeping reforms. New oversight committees were established, composed of community members to ensure transparency in handling complaints. Training programs focusing on empathy and de-escalation became mandatory for all officers, reflecting a step forward in rebuilding public trust. The woman, however, remained focused on the bigger picture. She didn't celebrate small victories but viewed them as milestones in a much larger journey. Her advocacy expanded beyond her city, inspiring similar movements in other communities. She collaborated with national organizations, advocating for federal standards to address systemic inequality and promote fairness in law enforcement. Her story reached classrooms, where educators used it as an example of courage and the importance of standing up for justice. Students across the nation discussed how one person's determination could ignite a ripple effect of change. Her efforts reminded everyone that speaking up against wrongdoings could inspire collective action. The officer's journey took a surprising turn. The mandatory training sessions he attended opened his eyes to the impact of his actions. Listening to the stories of those he had harmed was humbling, forcing him to confront his biases. Though it didn't absolve him of his mistakes, it gave him a chance to reflect and understand the role he had played in a flawed system. The woman continued to speak at events and forums, emphasizing that change required unity and persistence. At one such gathering, she addressed a crowd of thousands saying, "We cannot afford to be complacent. Every step we take is a step toward justice, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come." Her efforts culminated in the launch of a national campaign aimed at educating young people about their rights and fostering trust between communities and law enforcement. The initiative brought together voices from all backgrounds, highlighting the power of diversity in driving meaningful change. As she stood on the stage at the campaign's opening event, the woman held her badge in her hand. It no longer represented just her profession. It symbolized resilience, accountability, and hope. "This badge doesn't define me," she said, her voice firm. What defines me is the fight for a system that treats everyone with dignity and respect. Her story became a beacon of hope, reminding people everywhere that even the smallest actions could lead to significant change. Would you have the courage to stand up in a moment of injustice? Share your thoughts, and let this story inspire us to create a fairer world together.